Okay, I guess I'll crack on. Does that sound? Yeah, it sounds like an echo. Cool. Small audience, please don't feel afraid to go. If it's boring, I won't be offended. It's fine. I know it might feel awkward, but we'll get through it. So imagine a thing with some human faces. Well, what a treat. I get to stand, not worry about being on mute, kind of, and use my clicker and everything. It's generally quite exciting to be here. So, elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sexy, but I'm going to at least try and get your attention. So, bear with me. So, to set the scene, I'm in a lift. Yes, American friends, we really do call them lifts. And 4 people walk in, and I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close, I've positioned myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I hear the doors still shut behind me, and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important. I gesture to her, see? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. I say, oh, she nods, perfect, the CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. What are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing what, the volume of risk, and what I should show more interest in. Setting and changing policy is slow and hard to communicate, and people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do, but then I'm left playing catch-up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, say, try not to sound like a patronizing snake oil salesman. I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, but looks slightly less important. I'd make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It would be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker. Well, what's important to you? Managing risk, so mostly opportunity risk. The fear of missing out, so getting features out the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, as they glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that feels almost like it's designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say. This is your lucky day. Next person, they're dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO. Before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Oh, how did you get in my imagination? Okay, let me come back to you. My attention goes to the last person, hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write? It doesn't really matter. Python, they say. Cool. Have you got everything updated to work with? And I pause. Python 3 they offer? Yeah, that must be hard, I add. They don't know it yet, but I've just won some of their trust, which is, as we know, important. Nearly, they say. Cool. What's important to you? So staying on top of things like patching dependencies so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what I can bend, break, and what might cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code and avoiding technical debts, the rest of my team effectively being able to operate cohesively as work as one. Do you use any tools to help you with that? Yeah, linters, code quality, test coverage, the usual. Great, I say, I write code too, let's be friends. And I hand them a printed QR code and say, here's my public GPG key, so you know you can trust what I have to say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and then when it changes? Well, we get a memo, or maybe something stuck to a notice board. So last week we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. How does that work out? Well, it's up to us to then maintain that to-do list so we can onboard new people. Does it go wrong at all? Yeah, sometimes if we compile that operational manual incorrectly, we miss a memo or don't apply them in sequence, we get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped down all their whiteboards. I look to the dev. Sound familiar, I ask? They nod. Well, turns out we're not all special snowflakes, eh? All is not lost, and I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here. The lift is slowing. I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. They ask me as the doors open, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way to stop obstructing it, I answer, oh, I don't work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor, no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs as the doors shut and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of that sounds at least vaguely familiar and you can relate to some of my imaginary friends, then maybe I've got some answers for you. What if I said you could update policy easily, even releasing several version updates, not just in a year, a month, What about 10 updates in a single day, and seamlessly communicate those to the people that need to consume it, all without derailing them? You could have visibility on compliance using tools that perhaps you already use, and that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to be and not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally in CI and ultimately guard production. That multiple versions of the policy, like a dependency, are supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's now some known vulnerability type updates become a business as usual activity to communicate. Interesting? Okay, hang around. Cool, doing about all right. So, hopefully I've got at least some of your attention. It's time to introduce myself and start explaining things a little bit more. My name's Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor for LearnK8s and also for Control Plane. I'm a consultant to Crown Prosecution Service, which is a bit of UK Gov, and a tinkerer of open source stuff. I've spent a fair amount of my professional career now working in UK government and large organisations where problems like these are rife. We should have some time, if you need it, for questions at the end, or your best heckles, even better. If not, I'm reasonably obvious with pink trousers, so come find me. So given that I've got the luxury of a live audience, and you've all got your clothes on, which is a brilliant change from normal, by show of hands, who's with my CIO and has set, written, or applied some policy before? Any sort, any code, standards, anything like that? Cool. Okay, next round. How many of you have sought exemption, consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with at least some good intentions? Cool, good. Well, you fell for it. So thanks to the organisers, we've got all of your names and your employer's details down, so lend me your ears, and the stakes just got raised a bit. The doors are now locked. So where do I see policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, tabs being 2 or 4 space indentated maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which is ultimately becomes the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come up against a situation that you weren't anticipating. This is fundamentally not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex to navigate rulebook and harder still to measure compliance. It often can look like the thin bit of a wedge where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous with others looking to expand upon its scope. Which can lead us then to sometimes wonder if the cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software. So why does this all have to be so hard? Surely there must be a better answer. Well, we've codified everything else, so isn't this the answer, you might imagine? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we largely do it wrong. So maybe some of you are screaming your favorite product names at me in your heads as the solution, and you're not wholly wrong. However, the devil is in the detail. Throwing some curly braces or YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep that policy a secret. So exposing it could maybe be used against you by an adversary. However, this does not support us shifting left at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. Therefore, it doesn't take much imagination to see that in the scenario of an application deploy, midway through finding one resource is non-compliant and becomes rejected, that could leave your overall deploy in a halfway inconsistent state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was the policy better than the downtime? Especially if it leads your engineers, who are all hopefully plenty smart people, at finding inventive, should we say, ways around the computer says no response that they've got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test, or something goes wrong, so you form this case law, and you need to apply new policy. So maybe, I don't know, let's say all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could well be considered breaking. Sure, you might say you provide warnings, or at least kind of less important issues, or maybe new emerging policies, which is great, so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted GitOps, or at least maybe CI/CD, is anyone seeing those warnings? So who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Exactly. Well, if you are, I'd politely suggest you're probably missing the point in CI/CD. You should ultimately be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not just here to throw stones. So if we remember my implied promises to my 4 imaginary friends at the start of what this promised land might look like, well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved all of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and kind of join the dots. So, well, the first is something if you're doing policy as code, you're probably already doing, so put it in version control. The thing you might not, however, be doing is then making that visible. So at least inner source it, by which I mean allow anyone within kind of your walled garden of employees, suppliers, and so on to see the policy. I'm not saying give all of your kind of threat monitoring and intel rules away. You can probably keep those to yourselves. But I'd argue that visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime, reverse-engineered workarounds, and opaque legacied exemption spaghetti soup. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks an ability to work really well with prospective suppliers without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only then stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible to those that need to be able to see it. Many of you, I'm sure all of you, in this room at least, are used to semantic version, but a quick recap. So the first segment is to indicate breaking changes, so perhaps conflicting in the context of policy, however. Let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will help with some, say, internal cross-charging. Who knows? I'm not really judging. And increments that might look like requiring it to be from a predetermined list rather than free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes. These shouldn't break anyone. And increments that might look like, say, correcting a spelling mistake to one of the department names. Third segment is to indicate patch changes, so these should be a no-brainer for everyone to keep up to date with. And increments that might look like adding a department to the list of available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository, it's versioned, so we can easily communicate the policy, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are all managed by semantic versioning. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? So you might unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package manager, perhaps. Okay, so policy is visible in its version, we can communicate it, we can tack on release notes and expectations managed by Semver. It's all beginning to look a bit more like how we develop software. Okay, I know testing is a really dirty word, but in order to make this an asset that everyone can depend on and also provide some kind of known good examples, tests are fundamentally essential to give everyone the confidence in the stability and surface any potential side effects before they then hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against this policy locally and in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and better informing everyone. So, as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Okay, we're well and truly on the home stretch. So it's dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. We can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependable or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull requests, tests, even auto-merging if you like. Okay, so to check you're all still awake, can anyone tell me a recent event that caused everyone to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? Help me out. Go on. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Bingo. So as you know, all presentations this year are actually contractually required by the organisers to reference log4j, even when it's almost entirely out of context and includes some memes about it. So in just a few short months, I can remove all of these and hopefully just broadly point at a list of scary-looking CVEs in order to command your behaviour through fear. What I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something that your organization is hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if our policy is a dependency, this is now not at least a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, right? Which can allow us to measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered a lot of ground and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing, and it's not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. It's time to look at how you might be actually able to do this, and I know you all really came here wanting to look at a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! To maintain scope, though, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things just to prove that it's not one tech or one tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes. I could probably have picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy really to invent much at all here. So likewise, I'm going to pick two tools. But again, these could be some or even all, probably. So in this case, LearnK8s is going to be doing my Terraform, and Caverno is going to be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization. There'll be a link at the end as well. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code that's on the screen, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that I made a real thing that actually does exist in the world. So the policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts at V1. I've got policy that requires a department label on all resources. So long as it's set, it doesn't matter what it is. I've written tests for this, so you can note how the parsing test cases are useful as a great example of what good and bad looks like. We've pushed a tag in Git. We've added release notes. I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which obviously it does, but moving on. Version 2 looks similar, only now that department field has to be one of a predetermined list. Like before, test exists, release notes are written, tags are signed. 2.1.0 is where we notice and correct that spelling mistake of one of the options in the list of the departments. And 2.1.1, and I've now added the new department to the list. Okay, a few more repositories in that organization. App1 and Infra1, well, they depend on version 1.00 of the policy. It's not compliant with version 2 or beyond, but how do I know that? Well, I configured Renovate in this case to automatically make me a pull request. So when it sees a new version of the policy, it's super obvious if I can update that dependency, and I can also see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can see all of the pull requests over the organization, so I could use this maybe to measure my compliance of the policy. Moving on from that, a few more repositories, App2 and Infra2. Well, these depend on version 2.0 of the policy. However, we could merge the open pull request all the way up to 2.1.1. And finally, App3 and Infra3 are dependent on version 2.1.1, and they get a gold star from the CIO. There is a small touch of magic, and it's not pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I've probably absolutely, definitely, yes, absolutely, written a lot worse. But what this does is it allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy that I've declared. Ideally, this might be kind of less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the policy to be accepted and evaluated all within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. So Cube gives you admission controllers. It's not so easy to get, so far as I found, the same sort of policy evaluation in cloud. They've got their own policy code, and I've not figured out how to be able to evaluate that locally. Again, pull requests and collaboration, all very welcome. So you may have noticed the way that the policy was written and defined and distributed lends itself well to coexist with itself on a Kubernetes cluster. So think multiple versions of itself on the same thing. Which brings us to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all the versions of the policy that we've described so far. So I've applied all 3 versions of the policy. Likewise, cluster 2, well, that only accepts 2.00 and greater. We can automate all of this using kind for CI to deploy the apps to prove that it kind of works. And there we have it, a full org, all done, all compliant policy, all versions, and CIO all aware of what's going on. So this is great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story about why it exists? After all, if your agile delivery teams are even kind of half effective, they will reject absolutely anything that they perceive to be friction that they don't see value in. This could allow our devs to know why they're compliant. And if they want to do something outside of what the policy can outrightly permits, they don't need any sort of exemption granted per se. They can have a well-reasoned, informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. So imagine, if you will, going through a stage of versions with risks that inform the mitigations manifested as policy, all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policy can move with it. When perhaps when some new privacy regulation comes out, or your latest marketing strategy pays off, and you acquire a load more data, for example, even if your policy was perfect at one time, well, the risks and the appetite for it will stay still for no one. We can liken this to over-provisioning in some ways that we might be familiar with from elsewhere. So where lead times are long, change is hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead to hedging bets against what some future state might be, rather than proportionate mitigation to risks that are more tangibly real in the now. And that's where the real culture change is needed. And the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. So for now, this is all really over to you. Honestly, the best thing any of you could do right now would be to tell me this is madness. It's already done, irrelevant, or otherwise totally unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber of peers have yet to do. So beyond making some pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building a case study with more real willing organizations and allow me to swap out some of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing that I want you to remember from our time together is, and feel free to say this out loud with me, purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy, which I've been practicing saying far too many times. I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to leave. I'll destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier. I'll try. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn, GitHub, whatever. You can be rest assured that there'll be little to no content. I'm pretty awful at any sort of self-promotion, especially on social media. And cns.me just points to my LinkedIn. And talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and they're all open source. Questions are very welcome on this or anything else. I've got some time left, I think. Or find me afterwards somewhere. I'll be the only worst person around that's in pink jeans for the rest of KubeCon. Thank you very much.